Hello again. So, welcome once more to Lam Rim, and we are still on chapter 15, I think it is, and we are discussing the aspects of insight and how it relates to how emptiness relates to emptiness itself. So before we start, let's do our best to set motivation to think about how to use this opportunity to develop our own insight in order to benefit all beings. So this is quite a complicated area for me but I'll do my best to express it as well as I can. So one of the questions that Rinpoche is asking now, or that we might ask ourselves, is when we read the Middle Way tradition, the Madhyamaka texts, we'll find again and again the tetralemma. The tetralemma, or the Chatuskoti, is a fourfold choice. Essentially, the word, I think, came from early Western academics who are studying these sorts of texts, and it's based on Latin of Greek. So like dilemma means two options, di being two and lemma being options or alternatives, and here tetra means four. So it's essentially four options, so a fourfold argument or fourfold analysis. So this is the tetralemma, or it's also in Sanskrit called the Chatuskoti. I don't know which I'll use or which we should use. So before going a little bit further, maybe it's a good idea to think about what that means. But I'll ask the question that he asks, which is saying, okay, so we find in the Madhyamaka again and again that this tetralemma refutes things based on the fact of whether or not they exist, they do not exist, they both exist and not exist, or they neither exist nor not exist. So this is the fourfold pattern that we'll find. And the question says, because what we understand is when we look at this through the analyses which are taught through all the great Madhyamaka scholars, that there's nothing left, that they can't exist, they can't not exist, they can't both exist and not exist, they can't neither exist nor not exist. So we end up feeling that, okay, well then everything has been refuted, everything is been destroyed, right? And this is the question. So stepping out for a moment about that is to think about, well, why are there four? This is an Indian philosophical grouping. It comes from quite an early Indian sources. And normally we might think that, well, exists, it's either here or this is here or it's not here, is a simple, straightforward dichotomy. It's, and not exist is the negation of exist and vice versa. So then on that sense, we always say, well, there's no alternative. On the other hand, we might sort of imagine, sort of with a philosophical hat on, if you like, that both states could be somehow simultaneously available in the same thing, or that neither states apply. So for instance, if we see exist and not exist actually a bit rather like sweet and red, then we could imagine just like strawberries, something can exist and not exist. Or again, if we imagine it to be distinct sort of qualities or aspects of an object, like sweet and red, then we could say, well, a bitter melon, which is green and not sweet at all, is being neither sweet nor red. We could say some things and they neither exist nor not exist. So like that, we might also think that some or all non-existent entities are a subset or a superset of, they're grouped within or they're grouped outside of the existent objects. So, or even they're synonyms of each other. So all these different ways are ways in which we might imagine somehow something to be. And the point about the Chetskoti, the tetralemma, is to eliminate any of these various different relationships as being available to us. So we might also sort of feel, anyway, so we can go on with all the different ways in which something may or may not have some sort of a relationship with existence and non-existence. And it's important. I mean, I think the thing really to remember is when we're challenging ourselves by attempting to expose our true nature, our minds get terribly tricky, and we'll try to find all sorts of ways to escape the challenge and look at alternatives and sort of shift to a conclusion where we feel we don't need to worry anymore. We don't need to concern. We can still hold on to ourselves. So that sort of mind is one where we see this sort of sense to jump from one thing to another. And what we need to do is to recognize that while this sort of idea of this sort of very simple sort of philosophy of existence and non-existence, if you wish, is sort of being talked about here, it doesn't establish this as being a philosophy of the Madhyamaka. It's just the tools that we use. So in general, Madhyamaka doesn't have very much to say in terms of objects and non-objects, but we're going to do a little bit of exploration in this session to look at some of the core ideas that are used in order to understand Buddha Dharma, the framework of Buddha Dharma. So this comes mainly from the Abhidharma rather than from the Madhyamaka, but it provides us with enough to get to grips with how to identify or to recognize the emptiness of intrinsic existence, which is our subject. So Rinpoche wants to point out that, but when in terms of the question, when we're saying, things either exist or not exist, we've already talked about the fact that this form of analysis really is only meant to be done against intrinsic objects, not intrinsic existence, not against conventional or normal existence. And he says thing. When we look at the word thing in Madhyamaka specifically, it has two meanings. This is also really, and not so much Madhyamaka, but in the Abhidharma, there's two meanings: are an intrinsic or inherently existent thing, like the idea of this cup floating around in space, existing independently of anything at all, or it can mean a dependent arising, something that arises from all the causes and conditions that allow for it to be. And also we have dependent designation, depending upon us designating it as being that way. So this sort of idea about dependent arising is very different. That a thing is very different from the idea of an independently existent thing. And in terms of the first meaning, Rinpoche says, we recognize that nothing exists intrinsically, nothing exists in this independent way. In fact, in that sense, when we talk about this sort of thing, the thing which is an intrinsically existent or a thing with an intrinsic nature, or by its nature it is a thing, then its own nature, then this is a non-existent. It's completely a non-existent. It's a fiction. It's a fabrication. The other thing isn't existent, it exists. We can talk about the cup meaningfully within the context, within the conventions and so on, and we can communicate just as we normally always do. So this sort of thing is through these two different meanings. One is a non-existent, the other is an existent. So not only that, we recognize that dependent arising, this dependent arising is likewise sort of proves the non-inherent, the non-objective, the non-independent nature of the things we have. These dependent things exist, but only within convention or within context, right? So this is so this second meaning of thing, in the sense of the contextual, conventional thing, is what is known in Sanskrit as bhava. So bhava is means an existent, right, or a thing. But we're going to use the word thing here for good reason. And all bhava are dependent arisings. They're compounded. They're made up of compounded of in terms of their compositional, but they're also compounded in terms of being caused and arising out of causes and conditions, and they're prone to disintegration. In other words, they're impermanent. So this nature about this thing is that it's impermanent because it's composite, compounded, and it's, while we can't notice it changing from moment to moment, that change from moment to moment, it will ensure its demise. It will cease to be. So that we need to be careful, though, is so we've identified things, and we've identified non-existence, but non-existent things such as an inherent existence. But Rinpoche here talks about uncompounded things, or the uncompounded entities or phenomena. The thing is a bit difficult because we're using that word to describe bhava. So the uncompounded is, well, what is that? What is an uncompounded entity or an uncompounded phenomena in Buddhism? So uncompounded is divided into two. Compounded just means compounded made of things, made of stuff, right? So uncompounded is not made of stuff, not dependent arising, and not dependent upon cause and conditions, and likewise not transient and not changing, not slowly disintegrating. So there are two things, two classes of thing which are uncompounded in the Abhidharma. One of them is non-existent things, right? Non-existent things are not compounded. And likewise, permanent things, right? In other words, things which do exist, but they are permanent. Now, there's only one class of object within Buddhism which is permanent. Everything else is material, is subject to change, and that class of thing are absences. So these are the two. There's what is and what is not. This division into existent and non-existent phenomena is a question of satya, which just means truth, right? So this idea of saying it's true or it's not true, it is or it isn't, right? It is sat, and it isn't, is it asat, right? And so the question of is or isn't is called satya. So this division here, what is not, this fictional objects, asat, like James Bond is a fiction, right? So it's not just spiritual things. Anything that is a fiction, that is false, non-existence, right? They're non-existent things. James Bond, you might argue, is a person, and so on, so on, so on. But when we look at it, the causes and consequences and effects of the character are completely determined by the author or authors, right? So what we know is that the entity that is James Bond is a fictional entity, not a real, not real, yeah. And not only that, we can definitely say that we can be inspired by or influenced by stories, and the stories themselves are things, they are entities, but the contents of those stories, the fictions, are non-things, they're not real. That's what makes them fiction, right? So, and another one of these non-things is the inherent existence. So sat, what is, right? This is satya. So we have thing and non-thing, and we have sat, which is things which are, is divided in on a question of what we could call nitya. And this is whether or not a question of permanence or impermanence. And this division is that anicca are those things which are impermanent. Nitya means permanent. So anicca, one of the three qualities of conditioned compounded phenomena, is that things are impermanent. This impermanent specifically means that it's changing continually, and that change will bring about its dissolution or destruction or its end. Yeah. So everything that is changing very, very gradually, it will end. But Nietzsche are mere absences. So the absence, for instance, of an elephant in this room, bringing back the elephant, the lack of an elephant in this room is an absence. It's not prone. The absence of the elephant is not prone to a momentary disintegration. Right, moment by moment, the absence of the elephant doesn't moment by moment cease to the point where suddenly an elephant appears, because the absence has ceased. Right. I mean, there's this whole thing of saying, like, if I could wait around because of the absence of $1 billion in my pocket, right? If this is slowly decaying, there's going to be a point when $1 billion will suddenly appear in my pocket. But then that would also be true of all the infinite different other absences, including the absence of the debt of £1 million. So, the absence of also, anyway, same thing. So an important example of an absence is nirvana, which is the absence of suffering and its causes. So we can see clearly that what is, we need to include the absences of suffering, for instance. So an absence is definitely not a fiction. It's a truth, but it doesn't itself disintegrate. But there's no assertion, there's no assertive or sort of present aspects to any permanent absence. It's just a mere absence, or just a mere lack of something being there. So one of the aspects of this, and I'm coming back now to Rinpoche, is that the uncompounded are the non-existence. Non-existent things like James Bond is uncompounded, and also permanent, such as absences like nirvana. These are uncompounded. The existent things which are compounded are normal things, and we call them things. So, and finally, there's this primary distinction to be made between a fiction and an absence. So when we look at an absence, it doesn't really in itself determine whether or not the thing that is missing is existent or can exist, right? Whereas a fiction is very clear that it indicates that it cannot exist, that it is not possible to us. And because of this, we can then talk about something naturally being absent because it is a non-existent, right? So something naturally is absent in this room, like a hobbit which is a fiction, is naturally absent from this room because there are no hobbits. So while an elephant would find it difficult to come into this room, let's say a mouse could easily come into this room and has done in the past. And so we could say, well, currently there are no mice present in this room that I know of. So, but I know for sure there are no hobbits in this room because hobbits are a fiction. So this is a very strong distinction that we can make between absences and fictions. And one of the things about natural absences, in other words, absences of fictions, is that the absence of inherent existence is natural, right? It's a natural absence. And this is known as suchness or tattva. So this natural lack of the fictional entity, or the fictional intrinsic nature, is tattva, or suchness, or thatness. It doesn't require a mind or a Buddha for suchness to be present in all phenomena. So Rinpoche is making the point, essentially, that saying that while we talk about the tetralemma, and in this particular case, the question was arisen with things, the tetralemma also works just as well with the uncompounded as well. It follows exactly the same. And what we'll see is that if we are not careful, we must remember that whenever we're making a distinction between a thing exists, not exist, and so on, that we include the idea, if not the word, essentially, or objectively, or intrinsically, or and so on. Okay, so this is absolutely relevant. So let's, for imagine that sort of suggest that we don't qualify each of these alternatives. So we read a verse in the middle way, and it says, all is not existent, all is not non-existent, all is not both existent and non-existent, and all is not neither existent nor non-existent. Okay, this sort of text is, various different translations have it written different way, but these sorts of texts are very easy to find. And so because we forgot to, or failed to recognize the need to sort of qualify this as essential existence, intrinsic existence, and so on, we might then sort of imagine that we've really come to a great understanding, and with a sort of a sagely frown, we might say, aha, not existent, aha, not non-existent, not existent and non-existent. Now, but the point is, and this is what Rinpoche says, is that when we follow with the last of the four and say, lastly, not existent nor non-existent, we're rejecting both the first 2 points we've just made, right? Because we're saying not existent and not non-existent. So if we're saying this, then saying neither not existent nor non-existent is just a denial, or if you like, a conflict directly with what it is we've just literally just said. And in this sense, it's like it's completely clearly that we don't understand what we're talking about. So then Rinpoche says, yeah, well, we might be sort of feel that, actually, even though we have said this, there is no mistake. We have not made a mistake in what it is we're saying. And instead of being sort of wise and understanding, in fact, what we've done is we've destroyed reasoning itself. And because reasoning is the method used by the Madhyamaka for establishing the lack of inherent existence, all we've done is confused ourselves and become completely incoherent. So this sort of aspect about recognizing that incoherence is a very available interpretation of the Madhyamaka. It isn't what the Madhyamaka is about. It's not what the middle way is about. And incoherence is not the middle way. Confusion, throwing ourselves into a state of confusion, is not the middle way. We're not here to create a confusion. It is confusing sometimes to analyze emptiness and to understand the emptiness of intrinsic existence. But that's because our mind is struggling so hard with it. All the time it's struggling so hard. So then, therefore, when we... and again, it says that when we recognizing the absence of inherent existence, or the inherent nature, or intrinsic nature, with regards to ourselves, and we recognize our own selflessness at that moment, even intellectually, then this clarity, this conclusion arises that the intrinsic nature that's dominated my mind, that I've clung onto for so long, it doesn't exist. So the intrinsic nature doesn't exist. And this is wisdom consciousness. This is the meaning of wisdom consciousness. So the absence of inherent existence, which is the object, what it is that we've noticed, the object of our wisdom consciousness, exists as an absence, right? So this is the part where it's sat, it exists, and it exists as a nicha, as a permanent, right? An absence. So this point is essentially that if we have destroyed everything in a tetralemma earlier on, you know, with this exists, does not exist, does not, and so on, so on, so on, then we've certainly missed the point of the middle way, because we've just destroyed the object of a wisdom consciousness. And having destroyed the object of a wisdom consciousness, this means that we've definitely not got the ability to recognize that objects have no intrinsic existence. So Rinpoche then makes the point of saying, well, look, you know, if we are going to deny both intrinsic nature and the absence of intrinsic nature or intrinsic existence, how then do we actually recognize the object of wisdom consciousness? Because if we're denying the absence of intrinsic existence itself, then we've basically lost the object of wisdom consciousness. So how do we establish wisdom consciousness that recognizes selflessness? So this sort of question is primarily saying, okay, well, look, from a Madhyamaka point of view, this seems to be completely incoherent. If we wish to go on this journey, we have to be able to establish how the wisdom mind works, because it's not middle way. It's not middle way philosophy. So then we might read another question. This is from the Madhyamika Karika, Mula Madhyamika Karika, known as the MMK, or the Fundamental Treatise, written by Nagarjuna. And in there, in chapter 13, it sort of says, if there was the slightest trace which is non-empty, then a trace of emptiness would exist as well. As there is no trace that is non-empty, how could there be a trace of emptiness? Now, this is quite a convoluted verse. Rinpoche pains to point out that the mistake in terms of thinking that therefore emptiness is somehow non-existent because it is itself empty of inherent existence. He says the mistake is to think that empty without being qualified is being read as non-existence. We are continually faced with this again, and Rinpoche points it out again and again, is that when the term empty is being used within the wisdom tradition, it means empty of intrinsic or existence or objective existence, or all of these other synonyms that I keep on going on about again and again. So we accept there's no intrinsic nature at all. Nothing is intrinsic. So the absence of intrinsic nature doesn't disqualify it. It marks it as just the same as everything else. So this verse itself was actually used by Nagarjuna to establish that emptiness itself, the emptiness of inherent existence, is itself empty of inherent existence, and this is the emptiness of emptiness. So always we have to recognize within the Madhyamaka, everything without qualification is empty of inherent existence, including emptinesses, right? Absences. So this is why we were talking earlier on about uncompounded phenomena. It's because uncompounded phenomena, permanent phenomena, are also empty of inherent existence, and that includes one of the relevant uncompounded phenomena, which is emptiness of inherent existence itself. So, but Rinpoche wants to pull us back a little bit on this and say we don't want to get lost in this empty, the existence of absence is. Yeah, he says, it's important for us not to start sort of thinking about whether or not an absence exists somehow as an entity, right? So while we talk about absences, and we can talk about the emptiness of absences, and we can talk about them being existences, otherwise we'd have all sorts of problems. But we do also need to recognize that they are merely absences, that they're not something, right? And in that sense, they're very distinct from things. And he says, he says, well, look, when we're meditating on the absence of intrinsic, if I'm meditating on the lack of objective existence of this cup, or the lack of objective existence of this fist, the fist doesn't float away. It's very much imputed by the mind, put on a whole bunch of causes and conditions that, and circumstances give rise to a fist, as well as the language and the perceptions and so on that all define and correlate and provide us with a framework for fist. All of this, right? So it's like saying that although it appears very strongly as to be here, in a sense that's really to do with my ignorance rather than to do with something on its side of making itself appear as a fist, or arising as a fist. Yeah. So when we're doing that meditation on recognizing the absence of that objective fist, we don't start thinking about that absence as to whether or not it exists or doesn't exist. And this is what Rinpoche wants to say. We're just focusing upon the absence of what is projected or imputed through our ignorances, right? That's what we're working on. But I mean, in many ways, we can talk about absences, and we can certainly say whether or not they exist or don't exist, just as we talked about earlier on. For instance, the absence of a living elephant in this room is very clear to me. It's quite clearly it does exist an absence of an elephant in this room. But on the other hand, and that's a conventional truth, it's true. And the absence of a living Ben in this room is a conventional falsity. So I can easily say, yes, it's not the case that there is an absence of Ben in this room. It is the case there's an absence of a living elephant in this room. So this sort of allows for us to use these words. But when we start saying the absence of an elephant in this room exists, we don't want our mind, which tends to cling on to things existing as somehow objectively existing, to start playing games with us. Right? So it's best not to sort of allow our minds. We're working primarily not on philosophy, but on experiential understanding. So we don't want to be sort of just getting ourselves into a kerfuffle, as they might say. So we might have this idea, somebody might hold on to the sense that actually the nature of this object is that that there really is a lack. There's an absence of inherent existence, and that absence itself is a fundamental truth, an objective truth, a real truth. Yeah. And when we're doing that, it's important for us to be able to refute the existence of that sort of emptiness, because we don't accept it. I mean, again, we don't accept the idea of an objective truth for anything, including emptinesses. But so while it is true to refute any objective existence with using the of emptinesses or absences within the tetralemma, it's not appropriate to do that with mere emptinesses or apparent, or actual emptinesses in terms of the conventional sense, right? So then it comes. We can ask ourselves, well, hang on, man, what is this? How could we begin to develop this idea that the absence of intrinsic existence is somehow intrinsically exists? So how is it we can sort of say that the absence of the inherent existence of this cup somehow inherently exists, right? So it's unlikely that when we talk about the absence of the inherent existence of the inherent nature or existence of this cup, that it's that is somehow the intrinsic nature of the cup, right? But And this is the point, is we might imagine that the lack of intrinsic nature of the cup is its objectively true nature, right? And then we might sort of begin to start thinking about the no cup as being the nature of the cup, right? The true nature of the cup. And that's where we start falling into a whole series. I mean, there are plenty of even Buddhist teachers who make this mistake. So it's like saying somehow that this no cup or no elephant or no ben is qualitatively or accordingly more accurate or more precise or more insightful than cup or elephant or ben. So again, and Rinpoche's, this is primarily the subject of this half of the chapter. He's sort of saying is that, okay, we as mentioned, we've got to because nothing whatsoever is not empty of intrinsic existence. In other words, everything is empty. Everything, both in existent things and non-existent things, and on uncompounded things, everything is empty of intrinsic existence. It's naturally empty of intrinsic existence because intrinsic existence is a fiction. Because of that, we have to accept that even this lack of, this absence, right, of intrinsic existence, this natural absence of intrinsic existence, is itself absent of intrinsic existence, right? And this is the emptiness of emptiness. So Chandrakirti says in one commentary commenting on Aryadeva's 400, he says, you know, as there is nothing that is not empty, yeah, from what can emptiness arise. So if we disagree somehow and actually deny the empty nature of emptiness, or we say, oh, that's just crazy. I mean, it is actually the nature of these objects is that they're empty. That the fundamental nature of it is that they're empty. Then that absence of intrinsic nature, the absence of intrinsic nature, would not exist. Right, because we're saying it doesn't exist. So the absence of the intrinsic nature of the emptiness, right, would not exist, and then it would be infeasible for us to deny emptiness because we've just said it's not present with the emptiness. So we have to accept that emptiness is actually empty. So there's a similar to the same sort of aspect about intolerance. If we feel that if we develop an intolerance of intolerance, then we're being intolerant, right? So then we need to be intolerant with ourselves. So as soon as we recognize, we might say the only people for whom I am intolerant are intolerant people. I'm intolerant. I am intolerant with intolerant people. So it's like we have to be aware of the fact that the scope of emptiness includes itself in this. It doesn't exclude itself. And Nagarjuna also says as much when he says, you know, if the absence of intrinsic nature were refuted. So this sort of thing primarily is to say we've got to recognize that emptiness is itself empty. So again, we might think, hang on, well, look, you know, I can stop sound with a sound. I can say shh, right? So if with a crowd of people or a few people who will listen to me and I go shh, everyone will go, right? So we can use sound to stop a sound. So maybe then, therefore, the absence of the intrinsic existence of my words prevents me from being able to demonstrate any claim of the absence of intrinsic existence. And of course, the response to this sort of question should be pretty clear now, which is while we can say shh, and that the example is correct, the reasoning is unsound. In fact, it's the opposite. Only words that have no inherent existence can be functional, right? Because functionality, being able to make a difference in the world, is not a property of the fictional, right? And it's not a property of absences. So only things are capable of being able to make a difference, and only things things can only appear as dependent arisings, and because they can only appear as dependent arisings, including words, they are non-intrinsic. Therefore, we can say that because it's only because they have no intrinsic existence that they're able to function. It's not the absence of intrinsic existence within those words that makes them function, right? The fact that they have an absence of intrinsic existence is correct. They naturally have an absence of intrinsic existence, but it's not the absence which causes the function. Yeah. So this particular says, if we did imagine that it was the emptiness of the words that caused the words to function, then in terms of saying it's the emptiness that is actually doing the function. It's not causing the words to function. It's actually doing the functioning of those words. Then we would have to say that we've turned an absence into a thing. We've turned an absence into something that interacts directly, rather than just being a mere absence. So again, going back to the earlier verse we talked about from Nagarjuna, the one that established if there were a slightest trace, which is not empty, which is this introduction in chapter 13, verses 7 and 8, I think. Then the next verse is also follows, that says that through understanding emptiness, one is recognized that the Buddha Dharma is free from dogma. De Tsongkhapa said that emptiness eradicates all dogmatic views. As for those who take a dogmatic view of emptiness, he said they are incurable. So this is the following verse. So what does that mean? Rinpoche says we need to be careful, and we don't want to think that somehow having a view of emptiness is dogmatic or makes us incurable. So what is actually being saying? So he says it doesn't mean that when we recognize that everything is lacking any intrinsic or inherent nature, or inherent existence, that this is a dogmatic view. Recognizing the absence of inherent existence in objects is wisdom consciousness. But if we then think that this lack of intrinsic nature is objectively, intrinsically true or fundamentally real, then we've entered into dogma. We've entered into an assertion, a principle of something being. It's a metaphysical assertion. It says this is a mistake. And he says essentially that if we, what we're trying to do is to remove these sorts of things, and is in trying to remove this absence, to recognize this absence, not to create it, not make it into something. And Buddha Palita, again, one of the great scholars here, talks about it in terms of nothing. I have nothing, and give me nothing. Another way of looking at it would be to say, if we saw, for instance, a sign outside or inside a shop, and or a cafe, let's say. So we have a cafe, and we go in there, and there's a sign on the wall that says "No smoking allowed." Yeah. So we look at the sign and we think, oh, okay, well, I can smoke my nose. I mean, no, as in N-O, right? I can smoke a no, because no smoking allowed. Just as if it had been a sign that said pipe smoking allowed, I might smoke a pipe. But here it says no smoking allowed, so I might as well smoke a no, whatever a no might be. Or similarly, we have no fishing allowed, right? So, okay, well, I can't do pike fishing or trout fishing, but I can do no fishing. So I'll get my rod out and start fishing for them no fish, right? This sort of thing here, it says, is important for us to not to fall into when we're doing our meditation or our understanding of meditation on emptiness. So if we recognize that no inherent existence does not mean some sort of special qualified existence, but it's actually just merely a lack of inherent existence, then we're on safe ground. So recognizing it's just a lack of intrinsic or inherent existence, we're on good ground. We're not falling into some sort of absurd sort of Monty Python sketch. But if we think that this no inherent existence is some sort of special qualified type of existence that's rare and special and holy or whatever, then we're lost. In terms of the way in which we're doing our analysis, we're not trying to create these things, we're trying to eliminate our ignorance. Yeah. So it's important for us not to imagine that we're going to find some holy state that's underlying some sort of transcendental insight that's present throughout reality that we're going to find and discover. We're talking about the absence of what it is that we stick onto it. This idea, this fiction, this fabrication that we imagine and see or in ourselves and all around ourselves. This is what we're eliminating. So we're primarily getting rid of the mud, not trying to find some underlying reality. And again, I said this before, is that when we start talking about no tree or no elephant or, no things, we can find ourselves, or sometimes we read these sutras that talk about the wonderful qualities of tattva or so on. We might begin to, suchness, we might begin to think that suchness is an entity, and suchness is not an entity in terms of it being something present. It's something absent. Yeah. So this is really very important for us to get correct. And again, Prasnapada Chandrakirti says, makes the same point. We mustn't cling on to emptiness as an objectively real thing. We're not denying emptiness. We are merely recognizing it. So the point again is to say we're not like by clinging onto it as being an objectively real thing, we've turned an absence into a presence. We're turning it into something that it isn't. And likewise, if we all we want to do is to just merely recognize the empty nature, the absence of this illusion. Yeah. However, we can also find in a verse summary of the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 verses, a quote like, a bodhisattva who thinks the aggregates are empty is meditating on signs and lacks faith in the realm of non-production. Or we can find in Nagarjuna, therefore, Buddha refuted views of self and selflessness. So these, when we read these, it's very easy for us to imagine that this is saying we cannot, we must somehow let go of everything. We've got to free ourselves of everything because we're not allowed to think about the existence, self, or selflessness, and therefore both of these are meditating on signs. But what is actually being said, and Rinpoche, Chandrakirti, Buddha Palita, and in fact the texts themselves say it, is it's wrong to have a view of emptiness. In other words, to manifest or to generate emptiness as if it is a thing. These citations are referring to this view which rests upon a fundamental or objectively true emptiness. Otherwise, they would contradict themselves. For instance, in the Heart Sutra, a bodhisattva should correctly view these aggregates as empty of intrinsic existence. So this is exactly on task, exactly what we would imagine it to say. And in fact, the very same verse summary of the 8,000 says, one who knows that phenomena do not intrinsically exist is practicing the supreme perfection of wisdom. So if we recognize that the phenomena do not intrinsically exist, right? And this is the supreme perfection of wisdom. This is the same text, right, as somebody who thinks the aggregates are empty is meditating on signs. We've got to work out how are those two different. And the distinction is one of them has created the entity of emptiness as being some special thing, some sort of fundamental truth. The other one is just merely recognizing the absence of something. Again, Chandrakirti says, a yogi views the emptiness of both self and that which belongs to the self, and thereby becomes free. So there's no doubt about it. What we're really saying is, we're clear about what the meditation of emptiness is. It's recognizing this absence of intrinsic existence. And because this idea of not holding on to dogma, not holding on to the idea of the fundamental reality being some sort of entity, some sort of emptiness, some sort of quality of non-thing, we're not making an assertion in this way. And because we're not making that assertion, we can't really say we have a philosophy or we have a dogma. And this is why, for me, I think it's better really to talk about the middle way school, the middle way tradition, as being an anti-philosophy. It's not trying to establish something. It's trying to remove, something that we've attempted to establish, or we naturally, biologically establish, which is a fiction. This fiction being intrinsic existence. So therefore, Rinpoche says, the root of all problems is the ignorance that superimposes intrinsic existence. This is exactly what we've just been saying. There's only one mind. There's one type of mind, one meditation, one consciousness that can uproot that ignorance, right? That can actually defeat that ignorance. And that is the mind which explicitly contradicts it. We cannot see it and deny it simultaneously. They begin to work on each other, right? And when we do that, when we recognize the falsity, the complete lie, the complete fabrication, the fiction of intrinsic existence, when we recognize that and notice, therefore, its consequential, its natural absence, because it being a fiction, it can't be present, right? At that point, just like the Hobbit can't be present in this room because it's naturally a fiction, right? Then essentially, this is the mind. This is the mind that frees us, right? So this mind that recognizes the fiction, recognizes the absence of that fiction present in any object that we choose, then this is the mind that kicks our intrinsic superimposition. And Arya Deva says on this that there is no second door to peace. That this is essentially the peace of enlightenment. So this is the only way for us to achieve enlightenment, is through recognizing this distinction. So again, Chandrakirti reminds us that the extinction of clinging is the cause of enlightenment. So this clinging, this grasping, is when we remove that completely, remove it, eradicate it, this is the cause of our enlightenment. And the cause of that extinction, again, is singular. It is the recognition of the absence of inherent existence. So we know, for instance, that calm abiding, shine, or serenity itself, provides us with a temporary freedom from attachment, right? Once we've really developed our mind, there's a temporary freedom of attachment, but it's not a complete extinction. It's not a cessation. It's not a destruction of this understanding. So when we actually use and apply this mind, our concentration, to recognizing the absence, complete absence of intrinsic existence, then there is no attachment available to us anymore. There's nothing there for us to be attached to anymore. So the important distinction here we've got to be aware of is that our object, or what it is that's lacking, is that which allows for us to be attached to it, or for us to be attached. At the same time, if we overextend too far, we lose causation, right? And if we've lost causation, then we've fallen again. This is things we've talked about again and again already over the last few sessions. So this sort of thing about recognizing that we have to sustain causation, dependent arising, and we also have to recognize that dependent arising means that there's nothing available for us to cling on to, then we've got the correct insight. This is quite an intensive session. So this is our correct insight then. But then, of course, Rinpoche says, look, we've plenty of texts which talk about the 3 doors to liberation, right? Signlessness, emptiness, wishlessness. But when we hear this, we've got to recognize that emptiness is the basis for those 3, right? Not the other way, not the other way. So essentially, yes, there's nothing wrong with those being correct, but he says there's a text called the Equipment for Enlightenment. I think it's a Sanskrit text. Explains that when we recognize that everything being empty, it means that it's free of intrinsic existence, and being empty, what use are the mere signs? What facility, or if you like, the mere appearance of something desirable ceases because we see it as being merely just a convention, just a one way of seeing things, right? It doesn't have any substantial independent ability to cause us happiness. It's just the way we're seeing things at the time. When we recognize that completely, right, then it holds very little power over us. It or they or I, all of these things, right? And once we've got rid of mere signs, just having become disinterested in them, then why would we wish for them? Yeah. Why is there any wish left for them? So this signlessness arises from emptiness, and wishlessness arises from signlessness. Now, if some rich billionaire were to offer us, sort of say, hey, I'm really impressed by what you do. I'd love to give you $1 million, right? We'd be like, ooh, yeah, okay. And then, but when they give it to us, it turns out that what they're giving us is $1 million of play money. And we're like, we might feel a bit disappointed. It's like, okay, well, I sort of thought that we were talking about cash. And they go, oh, no, just, here's some play money, right? So then it's like, we can recognize how that would be a disappointment to us. We might be actually feel a bit furious or cheated, right? But we do that sort of thing to ourselves all the time. Continuously, we do that thing to ourselves, right? Our sort of real hankering and our real desires for real things, right? For real achievements and real experiences. Yeah. They really are merely just empty hankerings and empty desires of an empty person for empty things, empty achievements and empty experiences. So this might sound like really depressing or upsetting, feeling that we're going to lose something or that we have lost something, right? But in fact, later on, we recognize, we become free and empowered, recognizing that we never had anything to lose in the first place. It never was there. It was just a fabrication. And having cleared that fabrication up, we are no longer confused or trapped or entrapped by it. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. Then and then what we're going to do is next session to look at non-negation and not negating enough in terms of our recognizing the absence of intrinsic existence. So what we need to do is to work on having recognized what it is that we need to do to eliminate, right? This recognizing the absence of intrinsic existence, the absence of this fiction. We now need to make sure that we negate it enough, and then don't over negate it. So negating means just getting, denying or cutting it off enough. All right, so let's for a moment just dedicate, consider anything that we've done today or in the session, and think, let's use this. Let's actually not just listen to it and be, but to try and develop a sense of inspiration to think, hey, I can do that. I can understand this. I can learn how to understand this, and I can actually begin to work on developing insight. And by doing that, then I can benefit all beings, and I can help the universe become a better place. What more could one ask for? Okay, so let's now sit for a couple of minutes.